Welcome to the UKCCSRC World View at the moment, 44 people online. Thanks for coming. This is, again, as we know, the traditional shortly after lunchtime slot. And this week we're having a presentation from the Northeast CCUS grouping and outlining the ACORN projects, plural. And the Northeast CCUS grouping is deliberately slightly obscure because it's northeast of the UK rather than northeast of Englandshire, just to remember that the UK does extend off the top of the map. And the Northeast CCUS Alliance was set up around, I think, probably mid-2019 with a group of people concerned to try and get a more coordinated action to portray CCUS in what's loosely called Scotland. And that has then been bolstered by a membership subscriptions from many companies, probably tens of companies by now, and an aspiring membership of probably up to 40 members we have now in that grouping. I declare a slight conflict of interest because I'm a resident in the Scotland bit of the UK. And then through help from the member companies and Scottish Government, we've managed to appoint Mike Smith as the Chief Executive of NECCUS. Mike is a man exemplifying the transition. First had a managing director post with Dong Energy for about 8 years. Dong, of course, was the Danish national oil company, if you like, and then decided to transition early and became Ørsted, which is now now Europe's leading wind power and renewable power developer. So that exemplifies that if you stand still, the world moves around you, so you better catch up and join in. Mike worked with Ørsted for probably till about end of 2017, had a couple of other jobs, and then is now under contract as chief executive, leading NECCUS extremely successfully from late 2019 up till the present. Mike will speak first, but before he does, I'll just briefly introduce Charlotte, the co-presenter. Charlotte works for Pale Blue Dot Energy, which was set up around the mid to late 2000s by people coming out of the oil and gas industry. Charlotte did, I think, an economics degree at Dundee, followed by a business MSc at Robert Gordon's in Scotland. Joined Pale Blue Dot around, I don't know, 2016 as a business strategy manager, and has moved on to be one of the lead business developers with the ACORN group of projects. So she'll run the second part of the presentation. So I'll now ask Charlotte to share screen and hand over to Mike, who will do the talking for the first part. Okay, let's go.
Thank you, Stuart. Appreciate that. So yeah, we're going to try and cover a fairly broad spectrum of what's going on in Scotland with respect to CCS, but also some of the wider decarbonising efforts, because they quite often can be complementary to CCS activity in terms of putting in place some of the key infrastructure that could be required. And if we maybe start with the first slide by just understanding a little bit that some of the targets and objectives that Scotland has are slightly different from the rest of the UK. So Scotland's targets, by and large, are in advance of the rest of the UK, exemplified by the fact that the net zero target written into law for Scotland is 2045, not 2050. Scotland's emissions as a nation as a whole are just over 40 million tonnes of CO2 per annum. And for a nation of a little over 5 million people, the carbon intensity is slightly less than some of the other parts of the United Kingdom, but still a significant carbon intensity to abate. And recently, the Scottish Government has been setting out some near-term targets ahead of 2045 as to how we can deliver on net zero by that time. Those targets, again, are pretty aggressive and ahead of those of the rest of the UK. So I've highlighted a couple on the screen here. By 2030, they are targeting 75% emission reductions from the baseline, 5 gigawatts of hydrogen production in Scotland. The UK targets as a whole at that time as enshrined by BEIS, is 5 gigawatts. So essentially, Scotland's going to deliver all of that. A significant scale up of CCUS towards the UK ambition of 10 million tonnes at that time, and around 1 million of zero emission homes. And in particular, that is likely to be part of a significant shift of home heating towards cleaner fuels such as hydrogen. It's also important to recognise that a lot of the activity that's going to kickstart the projects that will deliver this change are going to come from industry and the need to decarbonise industry. And in that regard, Scotland, like most of the rest of the UK, has significant employment and significant financial contribution from industry as a whole. I've highlighted some of the figures on there. So whilst industry is about 30% of that 41 million tonnes of CO2 per annum, it represents employment in excess of 300,000 people and 26 billion to the Scottish economy each and every year. So a significant challenge, but also industry in particular is a significant part of the economy as a whole. So if we move to the next slide, I'll speak a bit about some of the strengths that Scotland has that may help us to get to those targets and deliver on these very significant challenges that we face. And Scotland it's blessed in some ways with some significant opportunities. First and foremost amongst them is the fact that because of the pre-existing oil and gas industry, there is a significant amount of existing infrastructure, both in terms of onshore and offshore pipelines, terminals, compressor stations, gathering networks, and this map of Scotland tries to highlight some of those both onshore and offshore. The fact that we have multiple sets of infrastructure can allow us to, whilst the natural gas grid may continue for some years to come, to repurpose some of that infrastructure for dedicated uses such as the transportation of hydrogen and the gathering of CO2 for offshore storage. And when it comes to offshore storage, this is another strength that Scotland has. It has the largest CO2 storage potential in the UK. I think BGS recognise about 70 gigatons of potential across the UK continental shelf as a whole. Approximately half of that is in Scotland. And the vast majority of that, as you can see sort of shaded on the screen there, is in regions which are already connected to potential industry by offshore pipelines. And that opportunity means that we can go further than just meeting the challenge that Scotland has. We can help other parts of the UK and other parts of Europe. So the fact that we also have significant deep water port infrastructure, and that port infrastructure is used to transporting sort of large liquefied products like LPG, means that we can use those ports and that pre-existing infrastructure and the CO2 storage potential to offer a service to other parts of the UK in terms of the transport and storage of their carbon. The next slide shows some of the other strengths that we've got, and that is around the workforce that will be needed to do this. It is an area of significant study at the moment, the skills and the workforce planning that will be needed to deliver on the energy transition and a net zero economy. But needless to say, all of the work that is ongoing is highlighting the vast amount of resource that will be required. And unfortunately, not every part of the UK has that resource pre-existing. Again, the fact that the oil and gas industry has employed something in excess of 60,000 people across Scotland means that there is a large, highly skilled workforce that has the know-how necessary to help us deliver on the net zero change. And partly because of that, partly because there is a rich heritage of decarbonising projects in Scotland, we also have a wealth of projects, and we're going to speak about some of those projects, not least the Acorn suite of projects. But we're above and beyond Acorn. There are green hydrogen projects developing across Scotland. There's projects around direct air capture, and there's projects around CO2 utilisation. And I think it's important that Scotland continues to encourage these projects to grow because a carbon value chain needs all of these elements. And the sooner that we can have them all coexisting in a single geography, the sooner that we can integrate them together and show that they work both commercially, but also they work as an integrated system in terms of delivering the net zero change that we need. So the other part of this that I think we're looking to do right now is advertise something that we started as a region a week or two ago. And on the next slide, we're showing the fact that we, like some of the other clusters, are highlighting the opportunities that Scotland's got. And so approximately a week ago, we started a campaign, Back the Scottish Cluster. Those of you who are in Scotland, who have organisational presence in Scotland, I'd encourage you to look at this website and consider whether you could join that exercise. It's really an opportunity. It's meant to be inclusive. It's meant to allow other organisations to join it. And it's really there to promote what Scotland can offer, not just to industry in Scotland, but to other regions of the UK. And to highlight that there actually is a significant amount of activity and a significant number of industries that want to start this journey to decarbonisation. So that's a little summary as to what is going, some of the main reasons why Scotland could be the obvious choice to do work around CCS. On the next slide, I'll take you through a little summary of one of the projects that's ongoing at the moment. Again, common with some of the other clusters, which is the net zero roadmap that we are looking to develop for the east coast of Scotland, a region that represents about 80% of all of Scottish industrial emissions. This page sort of just shows that this is a Innovate UK funded project for which we are very grateful. We also have some external industry partners that are providing match funding alongside Innovate UK. And we have a fantastic project partnership group that includes academia, significant expertise from the supply chain, and existing project owners and developers such as Pale Blue Dot. So on the next slide, we'll just talk a little bit about what we're trying to achieve from this project. So the Scottish Net Zero Roadmap Project, SNZR, or SNZR as we call it, is there to address an industrial cluster that annually emits about 9 million tonnes of CO2 per annum. So as I mentioned before, 80% of all the emissions in Scotland. We believe if we can find solutions for that 80%, we have put the blueprints in place for the other 20. Within that region, there are 3 key subclusters around Grangemouth in Fife and in Aberdeenshire that represent the vast majority of those industrial emissions. And the region also, very importantly, covers many industrial sectors that I've listed on the page there. And that's critical because some clusters are highly focused in a couple of industrial areas. Their solutions can be tailored to, and the infrastructure can be tailored to those industries. But if we're going to achieve net zero as a nation as a whole, we need to consider regions such as this, where there are multiple industries that need multiple solutions, and look at how all of that can be integrated together. And indeed, that integrated energy system is a core part of what we're trying to do in the roadmap project. Who is doing this and which parts are they playing is shown on the next slide. And here we just highlight some of the work packages that we have going and who's involved. I don't intend to talk through this in detail, but it's a useful reference if you're looking to understand which parts of the project the various project partners are delivering. But I'll maybe just highlight that we will talk probably in a bit more detail over the next few slides about the core of the project. And the core of the project is enshrined in 3 work packages. The first of which is technology deployment. It's going to be vital that we understand what technologies are deployable today, what sort of disruptive technologies could come along in the future, and how those technologies could be deployed such that the learning curve and the scale cost curve can bring down their cost, because the cost of deployment is going to be directly related to the scale of take-up. And we're working very closely across the partnership to deliver that, and also working with a large stakeholder group across Scotland. Beyond that, we are then looking at how we look at the various options that individual industrial sites could take up. It's important to recognize that CCS is critical to this, but it's not the only solution. And indeed, nearly all heavy industry has more than one option that they could lean into. And so we need to consider the multiple options at individual sites, the respective pros and cons of those options, and ultimately get to some high-level engineering definition that the site can use itself to advance its own plans. And once we have that option definition and we know the technology that can be developed, we need to integrate it. And this is where we bring it all together in an integrated net zero energy system. This system is being developed by Energy System Catapult. They do this at a national level for organizations such as BEIS. And we're looking at this model at both a site level. So there's approximately 30 industrial sites that we're considering across the region. We are then integrating that to understand the infrastructure that's required. So there's an infrastructure module that will look at things like, what CCS gathering networks will be needed, what sort of offshore storage potential is required, what sort of injectivity for the wells into that storage potential could be needed. And then we're going at that one step further by also looking at, once this infrastructure is in place, how could that help other parts of the economy? And you'll see this on the scenario page that I'm going through here. Yeah, as well as looking at the needs for industry, we're also considering in the last couple of columns how this can support the rollout of these solutions into aligned parts of the economy, such as transport and heat. So, yeah, we believe that the net zero roadmap is a really important part of delivering a net zero future for a highly industrial area such as the east coast of Scotland. We're very appreciative of UKRI Innovate UK for funding not just our project, but the multiple other cluster projects that are going on in parallel across the UK, and we work very closely with those other clusters. But we're also very appreciative that this is part of a wider program, and that wider program includes looking at how we can actually build the infrastructure that the roadmaps indicate are necessary. And at that point, I'll hand over to Charlotte. And Charlotte's going to talk a little bit about some of that infrastructure that could be deployed and some of the existing projects such as Acorn, which are likely to be at the vanguard of using that infrastructure. So Charlie, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mike. So I'm going to take through what we're doing at the full Scottish cluster level with Scotland's net zero infrastructure. And then I'll provide a bit of an update on what is happening with the Acorn suite of projects at the moment. So similarly to NECCUS, at Pale Blue Dot, we were very fortunate to be awarded UKRI funding through the Industrial Strategy Challenge Fund to progress Scotland's net zero infrastructure, or SNZI, or SNZR, as we like to call it internally. And we have a group, quite a broad partnership working on this. The project is still in its mobilization phase, so I'm afraid that the overview that I will provide for you today is less sophisticated and complex than what Mike has shown we're developing through the roadmap work for Scotland. But what we are seeking to do is to really make the best use of all of the existing onshore and offshore infrastructure that we have to establish all of the infrastructure that we need that will plug in to a lot of the existing emissions that we have going on, and to integrate with the Scotland's Net Zero roadmap to anticipate some of our future needs for how to decarbonise Scotland. So as part of that, we are working with the Acorn partnership, is the core part of Scotland's net zero infrastructure. We're working very closely with Mike at NECCUS. SSE are seeking to explore the decarbonisation pathway for their Peterhead power station. Working with National Grid, who will be progressing some of the decarbonisation pathway for their feeder pipelines, which are pipelines from St Fergus gas terminal down into the central belt of Scotland and elsewhere into the UK. The University of Strathclyde will be doing some really critical economic impact assessment work and how Scotland's net zero infrastructure fits into the future net zero economy, which we're building in Scotland and in the UK. LNG9 are looking to progress a new power station in the central belt of Scotland, which has carbon capture technology fitted onto that from day one. and Petrofac are working with us to continue to progress our offshore storage resource and our understanding of that, and progressing it to its readiness phase for injection. On Acorn specifically, we're really fortunate to be supported through not only the Scottish Government but the UK Government as well, and we've also been a beneficiary of European funding through the Connecting Europe facility. So been really fortunate to have that kind of picture, like diverse picture of how the project is being able to move forward with public support, which has been really essential for getting us to where we are today, and where we're hoping to be in the mid-2020s, which is when we're planning for these projects to begin injecting. Pale Blue Dot leads the project. We're a wholly owned subsidiary of Storegga, and we are doing it in partnership with Shell and with Harbour Energy. Harbour Energy, until quite recently, were known as Chrysaor. So we have a really strong partnership of public funding, private funding, and also private expertise and, you know, industry skills and knowledge, which really directly relates to what Mike said about capitalizing on our existing skill set. What we're seeking to do with the Acorn project is to capture existing emissions from St. Fergus Gas Terminal, transport them through the GoldenEye pipeline, which is this dark line on the map here, and store them into the Acorn CO2 storage site, which we have the license for. And from there, that really establishes the initial infrastructure which is required, gets the pipeline and the well up and running in order to really catalyze clean growth on a much, much larger scale. So Acorn is designed to be modular, and that is how it fits as the anchor for the Scottish cluster as a whole. The fact that the project can be agile and modular to add on all of these different elements. So one of these is to produce clean burning hydrogen gas. I've got more slides on that just in a moment. Also to import CO2 into Peterhead port from other emitters around the UK, but also around the North Sea Basin and Europe, because Scotland is in a very blessed position where our storage potential is much greater than our emissions profile. So we're able to work really collaboratively with a lot of other emitters all over the place to store on behalf of, to provide this CO2 storage service. We're also seeking to decarbonise industry. Most of the emission sites, which Mike mentioned, are within 50 kilometres of Feeder 10, which is the pipeline that National Grid will be looking at in detail through the SNZR piece of work that is ongoing. And really to just take advantage of that store, around 30% of the UK CO2 storage site lies within 50 kilometres of the St. Fergus pipeline corridors, meaning that, again, that agile modular approach, we have a lot of potential to expand the storage potential that we are looking at from where we are now. So how we establish that initial store and then be able to grow and move into different areas of the North Sea for storage, but also into other areas of technology developments onshore. And some of that also includes things like our hydrogen production, direct air capture as well. So able to be agile, which is very useful. Our hydrogen project is about to enter its define phase, so about to enter its front-end engineering design. Hydrogen has been identified as one of the toughest challenges for the UK climate policy. Around 85% of the UK households currently use natural gas for heat. So being able to blend hydrogen gas into the national transmission system can start to make a real impact. A 2% injection of a 2% blend of hydrogen into the national transmission system at St Fergus alone, so just at one of the UK gas terminals, is the equivalent carbon saving of around 400,000 tonnes a year. So even though it's a small blend of hydrogen into one gas terminal, into the system from one gas terminal, it actually starts to offer quite a big emissions reduction saving that's scalable as well. So the hydrogen project can be up and running in 2026, starting with a 200 megawatt hydrogen production plant. It can then scale up to, with the addition of subsequent 200 megawatt hydrogen production facilities, and that will then increase that blend of 2% up into the national transmission system. One of the potential uses of acorn hydrogen that we are looking at is called the Aberdeen Vision Project, which we're exploring in conjunction with SGN. And this is to look at how we could get increase the blend of hydrogen into the national transmission system up to 100% by creating a localized network of 100% hydrogen gas. So this is another module of the kind of full development and of things which are being explored in Scotland as part of the cluster pathway to net zero, to create the blue hydrogen, transport it directly from St Fergus gas terminal into a new build pipeline from St Fergus down to Aberdeen, and then have a 100% hydrogen grid localized network in Aberdeen. A 100% hydrogen conversion would require an upgrade in a lot of our appliances which currently use natural gas. So there's a big opportunity. The change in appliances from town gas to natural gas took around 10 years. So we've done that kind of transition before in the UK, and there is no reason why we can't do it again. And finally, one of the other projects which I wanted to mention, and Aberdeen Vision, Acorn, North of Scotland Hydrogen here are only a few of the many projects which are going on in Scotland at the moment as part of our how we're looking at decarbonisation, is the North of Scotland Hydrogen Project, which Pale are working on with the Port of Cromarty Firth, Scottish Power, and three of the main distillers, so Glenmorangie, Diageo, and gosh, the third escapes me at the moment, but it will come to me when I don't need it. And what we are seeking to do here is to produce green hydrogen in order to decarbonize the distilling production. So this is quite a different use of hydrogen from what we're looking at elsewhere in the Scottish cluster and elsewhere in at Pale Blue Dot, but we're very strong proponents that we need blue hydrogen and green hydrogen to move forward and decarbonize. So we have both of these projects on the go at the moment, and I thought it was important to mention as kind of part of the bigger picture of what the Scottish cluster is doing. So that is the end of our presentation of our kind of whistle-stop tour through what the Scottish cluster is doing and what we've been up to in the last kind of year or so since I believe we last provided an update in this forum. And just leave here a reminder to check out the Back the Scottish Cluster campaign and to follow us on social media. So I'll stop screen sharing and I will pass back to Stuart.
Okay, thanks very much, Charlotte. So thanks, Mike. And to Charlotte, should now have quite a good overview of where the Scottish cluster's at, and it's rather a different set of flavours to those which we've seen in Teesside or Humberside, perhaps. So if people have questions or comments, could you please enter them into the chat, and that enables me to try and pick out questions to ask the two presenters. So the first question we've got here is from Ashafri, and he says, looking at the St Fergus site, what is the carbon capture technology being used at that site? So I don't know if Charlotte or Mike, which of you wants to explain that and the legacy piece?
Yeah, so at the St. Fergus gas terminal, we are planning to use an amine-based carbon capture technology. I can't say any more than that at the moment, but there is a press release coming out in the very near future where there'll be a lot more information about the carbon capture technology and the company progressing that at the moment for us.
Okay, and I'll just comment that independent of, completely separate to that answer, again, an example of legacy equipment is that the St. Fergus site has been doing carbon capture for about 15 years, albeit with different equipment through acid gas production from the North Sea and separating sulfur dioxide and carbon dioxide at that site. So there's an experience in the general vicinity. You don't have to explain to people what this means. Right, so again, let's go to jump to a question from Susan Fellows. Are you considering in this type of project offshore, I think UG must be offshore underground storage of hydrogen to accommodate the fluctuations and variations in green hydrogen supply?
So I'll maybe start with a view on that. So obviously, hydrogen storage is likely to be a critical piece of making a robust hydrogen network. It's very hard to get a view as to how much of that might be necessary. So one of the reasons that we're building a energy system model in the roadmap, and we're looking at getting from individual sites temporal data, i.e. how does their demand vary over time, both intraday and intra-seasonal, is so that we can look at what kind of demand imbalances there could be. With that, we can make some assumptions around the production imbalances and start to see where is the gap that storage has to sit into, both short-term storage and long-term storage. It doesn't directly answer the question. My expectation is we will need it. The size of it is something that I think the roadmap can help to put some insight into. And I do believe, just like in the electricity market, we're going to need a mixture of sort of intraday, intra-month and intra-seasonal. And that could be done in different ways. Some of the intraday could be done outside of underground storage, but anything beyond that is going to have to be underground storage. And there, well, there's work that Stuart's team are doing, which is excellent, around looking at how we can use some of the geological advantages that Scotland has to look at hydrogen stores. Some other parts of the country, but unfortunately not Scotland, to the best of my knowledge, have onshore salt cavern suitability, and that's already been considered. The northwest of England's looking at salt caverns that have been used already for natural gas storage, for hydrogen storage. But to the best of my knowledge, at least along the east coast of Scotland, I'm not aware of any onshore salt caverns that could be used.
Okay, I'll just add on to that because Mike partly highlighted it. So at University of Edinburgh, in a slightly separate but adjacent universe than we are undertaking quite a lot of fundamental work on storing hydrogen in porous rocks, porous sandstone rocks, because that's not ever been done before. That's going quite well. There's a lot of interest in that around Europe as well, with a direct analogy with methane storage, of course, which has worked for many, many years, decades, storing methane in porous sandstones. And we're also examining the capacity for salt storage, because although there's no onshore salt in Scotland, there's actually quite a lot of offshore salt, which is close to the coastline. So and again, both of those types of storage will have different characteristics. I anticipate that salt cavern storage will be medium volume, quick to charge up and quick to discharge, whereas sandstone storage will be much, much larger in volume and will take slow and steady charge up and slow and steady discharge. There's a couple of articles out about evaluating storage of hydrogen on the UK continental shelf, which either you can write to me and I'll email them to you, or we can do an UKCCSRC talk about that at some future date. So plenty of scope for storage should people need it, and not least the ex-oil fields. So I'll go to another question. Claire Goff asks is there any plans for BECCS biomass CCS plans in the Scottish region? And she asked again, what capture technology at St Fergus? I think we've answered that second question.
Sorry, that was a typo, that second bit, Stuart.
Right, okay.
So I guess
What
BECCS,
BECCS plans?
yeah, I mean, unlike some other parts of the UK, Scotland doesn't have any large biomass-driven electricity plants at the moment. It does have, however, quite a lot of smaller waste-to-energy plants. And so we are looking at the opportunity for waste-to-energy with CCS within Scotland. We think that that's something that could work very well, particularly at a local level, where you potentially have those waste to energy plants being in the same locations of some of the large industrial sites, so they could use some of the same infrastructure. The commercial challenges for waste to energy with CCS are slightly higher than those for pure BECCS. But the fact that they could potentially share infrastructure gives us some confidence that they could move forward. So large BECCS plants, I don't see it. Existing waste to energy plants adopting CCS, that I think is an opportunity for Scotland.
Good, okay, that's pretty clear. There are other sorts of BECCS as well, but we'll not go into that here just now because that's a bit too much. Question from Nicholas Perrin, a technical question, so I don't know if either of you have the answer to this. At what pressure will CO2 be transported to the offshore storage? Which may be a proxy question for is this dense phase or gas phase transport? Nicholas isn't clear on that. And then what level of cost is expected for the transport and geological storage from the port? And so those two questions, what's the pressure and what's the cost of the transport?
You're certainly right to assume that I don't have a technical background in a technical response. However, it will be in dense phase that it's transported along to the offshore site. In terms of the level of cost expected for the transport, this question is specific from the port to the from Peterhead Port up to St Fergus Gas Terminal. The study for that is currently ongoing at the moment. The comparative cost in Norway is around 130 euros a tonne. To put it into an international context, but we are doing the study work for that at the moment, and as soon as we have the numbers, we will be able to share them.
Just to also explain that the distance from Peterhead Port to St Fergus is colloquially not very far.
Yeah.
So building a link pipe is relatively straightforward and won't add very much onto the cost. And there's numerous studies, well, probably fingers of one hand, but still quite a lot of studies done on the converting Peterhead Port to accepting deep water tanker shipping. So that's quite a confident type of assertion, one of several options you've got for bringing CO2 in by shipping.
Yeah, Peterhead Port is already a deep water port.
Yeah.
And the distance from Peterhead to St Fergus is about 5 miles, not far at all. Yeah.
So I'll now go to a question from John Gibbons, which overlaps with Nicholas Perrin's second question. How much money will Scotland charge per tonne of CO2 shipped in for storage? And will the government get a cut of that via the Crown Estate? By which I would anticipate we might mean Crown Estate Scotland rather than Crown Estate England, because I wouldn't see that the Crown Estate England would have very much to do with shipping import to Scotland, but I can leave that to both of you to expand upon.
So how much will be charged depends on what the business model is, and as that hasn't been defined yet by the UK government, although I'm furiously trying to work with them to get to that point, we can't say. What we can say is that the cost, like any commercial enterprise, will be directly related to the upfront expenditure that goes into putting this infrastructure in place. And as Scotland has the opportunity to reutilize a lot of that infrastructure rather than build it afresh, there's potentially depending on the business model, some competitive advantage that Scotland has in terms of offering lower cost than others, because its upfront capital investment has been slightly lower than that of some of their competing projects, whether those competing projects are things like Northern Lights in Norway or in other parts of Europe.
Okay. And as for where the money goes to, I mean, the Crown Estate will get a cut of revenue for rental of the site, effectively.
Correct.
And my understanding of the revenues coming into Crown Estate Scotland at the moment is that's effectively a government revenue, and the Scottish Government has elected to transfer some of that revenue to regional authorities to localise the revenue benefits back into Scotland, which is different to the way that the English Crown Estate's treated its revenue at the moment. But I think all that will be decided in due course when the business models are decided. But I would anticipate that we're probably a lower cost operation than Norway. Right, so let's see. Going back to our Shrafi question on the hydrogen production, and the slightly technical question, how do you consider the value chain greenhouse gas emission for the blue hydrogen production, or just process emissions? By which I take to mean, how wide is the life cycle analysis of the blue hydrogen going to be examining?
So is this sort of in terms of scope 1, scope 2, scope 3? Is it that
he's not clear, but what I would think is, are we looking at, well, I would interpret that, are we looking at where the methane originates from, and are we considering, you know, the origin of the methane, or just the actual process on site, which is the usual base stipulation, is just that the methane arrives by magic from somewhere and you just process it, and that's the emissions they're concerned with. But I don't know if that's what you're doing in Acorn Hydrogen. And Charlotte might not know either. By the look of
her. So the question is, how are we measuring the emissions? We have done full life cycle analyses of the natural gas arriving onshore and then going through the treatment process taking place, and then the blue hydrogen entering the transmission system, and the CO2 kind of going over the fence, as it were, into the Acorn CCS infrastructure. And without having the numbers to hand, the studies that we have done so far do not find it to be any more carbon intensive in terms of the production of the natural gas just coming onshore and being blended into the system itself. So, and then of course the key difference being that when the hydrogen is burned at its end use destination, it's clean burning, which of course methane is not. So yeah, so that kind of, that is where we have managed to get so far with our studies on that.
Okay, so that's part of an answer. That's good. Different question. Where have I gone? Johnson Jimbar asks for custody during transport. How concerned are we about CO2 metering, fiscal metering, about what's coming in, who owns what, when, and how much ends up in the ground?
So I think this is increasingly an important part of understanding how this system will work in practice. So there is a growing recognition that custody transfer and fiscal metering at those transfer points are going to be vital to this. NECCUS participated in a study with DNV recently that Pale Blue Dot also contributed towards, looking at how not just the fiscal metering itself, but the sharing and transfer and custody of the data that fiscal metering creates is going to be vital. You know, in almost any of the business models that are under consideration, the government is a counterparty in, you know, whether it's a regulated asset-based model, whether it's a contract for difference model, the government is a counterparty. The government needs transparent, trusted data sets that it can use to understand where is the CO2 coming from, who is it being transferred to, at what rates, and therefore what kind of check am I cutting and to whom? So I think fiscal metering and custody transfer is going to be built very carefully into the commercial models that ultimately underpin this. And I go further and actually say you need to think beyond the metering itself and actually think about the data flows of the data that the meters will generate.
That's good. Thanks, Mike. I'm glad nobody asked the same question for hydrogen, because that's even harder. See, here's a technical question from John Gibbons again, probably to Charlotte, and you probably don't know, but have you had any concerns voiced about extra NOx, nitrogen oxides, from the hydrogen production?
No, we haven't had any. We haven't had any concerns voiced yet. As a bit of a general comment, what we are finding, I can't speak on behalf of the technical stakeholders that we engage with, but the ENGO community in most of the ones that we are engaging with are still forming their positions on hydrogen. So it may be a concern that is voiced in the future. In the not too distant future, some of their positions become more formed, but so far that hasn't been raised.
Okay, thanks very much. Let's see, go back to a question from Steve Corley on the overall project for ACORN, and either of you could answer this, I guess. What's the timeline for ACORN, which I think you put up vaguely, and when will we see first breaking of ground onshore and first injection offshore, which I would say depends on the government. But so the question is, what's the timeline, when does it start, and when does it succeed?
The timelines that we're working to at the moment, which, as Stuart says, depends on government business models, is to make a final investment decision on CCS and on hydrogen in 2022. We're not going to make the final investment decisions for the two together, so we're anticipating that the final investment decision for CCS will be in the first half of 2022 and hydrogen will be in the second half of 2022. And that should both be positive, then we'll be injecting in the mid-2020s and we producing hydrogen from 2026.
Cool. Okay, so I'm going to ask a question for Mike, just building on that, because it seems to me that we made a play, both of you, about the agility and the modular nature of the ACORN group of projects. So if Mike, comparing the ACORN style of development with modular incremental development mixed with some legacy equipment, how does that compare with what you perceive of as the Teesside or the Humberside style of projects?
Okay, what I won't do is pitch one project off against another. That's not
no. I'm just, but for the audience, I think they're quite different.
Just to clarify that up front. So this is not saying that any one project or cluster is better than any other. The clusters are actually collaborating very well together at present, and long may that continue. The difference potentially is the opportunity in Scotland to be more phased, for that phasing to recognize that the demand for these services, whether it's hydrogen use or carbon capture, will grow over time. And because some of the key infrastructure is sized for a very mature natural gas market, we have the luxury of leaning into that infrastructure and probably not utilizing that infrastructure fully until we get to phase 3 or 4 of that step change approach. Some of the other regions are having to build that infrastructure, and they have the challenge, which is a challenge that's existed for many years when you look at energy markets, of do you build that infrastructure for the demand that you have today, which is probably all that you can afford to do, or do you somehow find the money or get the grant support to build it for where you expect it to be? And if you don't do the latter, you'll have to build another one.
Yep. Tricky gambling. Okay, so that's good. And then following on from that, was partly a question from Tobias Lockwood asked, what does the cluster actually cover in this region? Because several UK clusters seem to cover a very wide area, others seem to be more focused. Tobias asks, what defines the optimum size for a cluster? And should they be big clusters or small split up clusters?
Yeah, somewhat of a philosophical question. I guess for Scotland at least, we look quite hard in an initial phase of the roadmap project over what is the right area to consider for our cluster. And we looked at a couple of opportunities there. We looked at the geography, i.e. where are the large industrial emissions and therefore where are the sites that ultimately need to be addressed. We looked at where is the infrastructure that could be utilized or and the key sort of points of potential hydrogen production and carbon storage. But we also looked a little bit more widely and thought about how these changes and that geographic region could play into opportunities in other parts of the economy. Yeah, so where are we likely to see changes in commercial heating and in the transport networks where these same bits of infrastructure are complementary. So yeah, I think that cluster thinking is largely related to how have you gone about this? Have you looked at the challenge and seen what opportunities that you have to address that challenge, and that's defined your cluster? In other areas, maybe they haven't had to think that widely. Maybe they've had a very clear, quite small geographic area where there is a huge amount of emissions today from a relatively small number of types of industry. And they've simply said, well, this is the obvious candidate for our cluster. So that's why you can see an area like Teesside that's quite geographically constrained compared with areas like Scotland, and a similar one is South Wales, where they're quite geographically diverse. The last point I'd make is pretty much every cluster maturing today is looking at one key sort of debarkation point, and that also defines the cluster. Yeah. So, and for Scotland, that's St Fergus. Down in South Wales, it's probably Milford Haven via ship. In the Humber, it's probably somewhere like Thedlethorpe or Dimlington, one of the existing gas terminals. So to split these up into multiple subclusters, whilst quite a few of the regions are thinking about that as they're developing their plan as a whole, that I don't think would work if you wanted to look at an end-to-end solution, because those small subclusters would ultimately all feed into the same storage point.
Yep. There you go. Good piece of string answer. So that storage dictates the end point for a lot of people, I think. Go back to Charlotte for a question here from Nicholas Perrin. Can you clarify any specific service offer you're thinking of to bring in on ship-in imports carbon dioxide from continental CO2 hubs as part of the project? And I guess you might also want to talk about continental import or even UK import.
Yeah. So if I've understood the question correctly, then what we are looking at in what we are developing at the moment is ensuring that our own port, so the receiving port of CO2 from elsewhere, is fit for purpose alongside the infrastructure for taking the CO2 off the boat into intermediate storage if that is required, depending on the demand. So we're looking at it and then to get it up to the terminal and through as well. So we're looking at that as well as the vessel design and the specifications for the CO2 to be transported in that vessel. So those are all of the elements of the production that we are looking at. Part of our development is not looking at the port at the other end, so the port from where the ship is departing. So that is where we're looking at the moment. If we were to, that is based on the kind of project setup that we have at the moment. However, there would be no reason if we were to enter into like work more closely with either Peterhead port or with another port to explore, like go into more detail to how the infrastructure could be developed elsewhere, or to like transfer our learnings from Peterhead port as the recipient port from another port as the export port. But yeah, those are the boundaries of our project development and our service offering at the moment.
And if I could expand on that with a slightly cheeky small plug, if you're interested in this topic in particular, and particularly filling in some of the gaps around what could be happening at the debarkation port, NECCUS does a monthly webinar. Our next one on June the 2nd has a talk from the Port of Rotterdam about their ongoing activities around decarbonisation, and that inevitably includes their plans for Rotterdam to potentially become a major point of debarkation for CO2 from continental Europe.
Good, thanks both. And I'll just go to probably the final question, which again from John Gibbons, which is actually two questions. The first one and the second one may be short and long. Is Scotland looking at land management tied in with biomass production and eventually for BECCS? And the second question is, are there any plans for direct air capture in this cluster? So anybody want to have a go at the first one first, or is that just out of scope?
Maybe better to do the last one first. There are definitely plans for direct air capture, and there is activity ongoing with Carbon Engineering, who is a key participant in the Back the Scottish Cluster campaign that we're working on right now. So there is definitely work there, and I think the other area, what I would probably do, if this doesn't sound like dodging things, if you're interested in that particular topic, I would look at a publication that the Scottish Government put out in December of last year, which is their most recent iteration of the climate change plan, securing a green recovery on a path to net zero. There is a significant amount of content in there on how they foresee land use in Scotland, and in particular the opportunity that peat has, as that is a strategic resource that I think Scotland has that the rest of the UK, perhaps with the exception of Northern Ireland, doesn't have to the same degree.
Okay, that's good. Thank you very much. And again, that's really points, I think, just to finish off, I'll just comment to finish off that although we've spent a long time talking about clusters, Acorn and NECCUS, these are all very much intertwined with a much larger vision of climate change plan for Scotland. And Scotland has got this slightly incredible ambition for minus 75% by 2030, which is a good 5 years sooner than the rest of the UK. And that's going to be quite an interesting and difficult challenge to meet. But what we've heard about today will be percolating through and be essential to decarbonising the rest of Scotland, ranging from buses to trains to people's houses and the way people live. So it'll be an interesting journey. So I'm just going to finish off to say thank you to UKCCSRC for hosting the conversation. There will be a recording of this posted on the UKCRC website. At the bottom of the chat, Mike has posted a link to the Eventbrite, link to the next NECCUS webinar, where you can look at the NECCUS website itself. And of course, finally, thanks to Mike for explaining the NECCUS organisation, and thanks to Charlotte for explaining the Acorn projects. And I'm now going to hand back to Vic if she's got anything to say, but that's, as far as I'm concerned, that's me done. Thank you.
Perfect. Well, I'd just like to say thank you very much to Charlotte and Mike for that very informative presentation and asking so many questions so thoroughly. And also to Stuart for sharing as well. I just wanted to say as well, we can actually add your events to our events calendar, Mike. So if people do miss it in the chat, then we'll put it on the UKCCSRC website.
Thank you.
section. Coming up next week, we've got a lecture, Systems Engineering for Carbon Capture, Utilisation and Storage, from Professor Mei Hong Wang at the University of Sheffield. So that is the same time next week, 2 p.m. Thursday. So we hope to see some of you again next week. But yeah, once again, thank you ever so much, Mike and Charlotte, and also to Stuart. So thanks all.
Thank you. Take care.
Thank you.
Right, well
Thank
done.
you. Bye-bye.
Bye for now.